The call came at 6:14 in the morning, which was how Nora knew it was bad news. Good news never called before 7. Good news waited until you'd had coffee, until you were sitting down somewhere soft and forgiving. Bad news called at 6:14 when you were still in yesterday's clothes and the mascara under your eyes had migrated somewhere near your jaw. She answered anyway. They found the accounts, her brother said without hello, without her name. Just that. Dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. Nora stood in the kitchen of the apartment she shared with 2 other women and a persistent mold problem near the bathroom ceiling, and she held the phone so tight her knuckles went white. "Which accounts?" she said. Not a question. All of them. Her brother, half-brother, technically, though their father never made the distinction out loud, was not a careful man. He was the kind of man who borrowed money from people he shouldn't borrow money from, who signed his name to things he hadn't fully read, who believed, with a faith that bordered on the religious, that everything would work out eventually. It hadn't worked out. Nora had known it wouldn't. She had said so, twice in specific terms, with the numbers laid out on the kitchen table of his house in Palmetto, and he had smiled at her the way men smiled at women who knew too much about spreadsheets and not enough about trusting people. The debt was $340,000. She knew because she had run the numbers herself 3 months ago, when she first started to understand the shape of what her brother had done. She had sat at her desk at the accounting firm where she worked entry-level for a salary that didn't cover her student loans and a benefits package that technically included dental if you didn't mind a 6-month wait, and she had run the numbers 17 different ways, and they had come out wrong every single time. "They're sending someone," her brother said. Today. Nora. I heard you." She hung up. She stood for a moment looking at the coffee maker, which was dripping its slow, indifferent drip into the carafe. Outside the window, Atlanta was waking up. She could hear a truck somewhere on the street below, the distant sound of a horn, a pigeon that had taken up residence on the fire escape and seemed to have strong opinions about mornings. She thought about running. She thought about it seriously, the way you think about things you know you're not going to do. The same way she'd thought about quitting her job every Monday for 2 years, about calling her mother back, about any of the exits she'd identified and never taken. She was not a runner. She had never been a runner. It wasn't stubbornness, exactly. It was something older and colder than stubbornness. It was the particular exhaustion of someone who had already been left behind enough times to understand that running solved nothing, because wherever you went, the numbers followed. She put the phone on the counter and poured herself a cup of coffee and waited. The knock came at 9. Not a knock, really. More like a statement. 4 measured strikes against the door, evenly spaced. The kind of knock that didn't wonder whether you were home. It already knew. Nora opened the door. The man in the hallway was not what she'd expected. She'd expected someone loud, someone with a visible weapon or visible anger, someone whose job it was to make her feel small. She'd spent the 3 hours between the phone call and the knock constructing a specific kind of threat in her head, and the man in the hallway wasn't it. He was tall, the kind of tall you noticed first and filed away immediately, the way you'd file away weather or the smell of smoke. Dark suit, no tie, the first button of his shirt undone in a way that was not casual but simply unconsidered, the way a man dressed when clothing was a practical matter and not a performance. His hair was dark and cut close at the sides, slightly longer at the top, and there was a scar that ran through his left eyebrow, old and pale, the kind a face wears so long it becomes part of the face. He was looking at her like he'd already made a decision about her and was mildly interested to see whether he was right. "Mrs. Vey," he said. Not a question either. "Yes," she said, because what else was there? "I'm here about your brother," I assumed. He tilted his head slightly. Behind him, in the hallway, there were 2 other men, younger, still quieter, the kind of men who existed in the background of situations like furniture. She barely registered them. She was looking at him at the way he stood, at the absolute absence of hurry in his posture. "May I come in?" he said. Also not a question. She stepped back and let him in. His name, she would learn in the next 4 minutes, was Merrick. Just that. No first name offered, no explanation given. The two men in the hallway stayed in the hallway. He sat in the single armchair in her living room. The good one. The one she'd found at an estate sale in Decatur for $30 and had carried home on the bus because she couldn't afford the delivery fee. And he looked around her apartment, the way an accountant looks at a balance sheet, noting what was present and what wasn't. She sat on the couch across from him and put her hands in her lap and didn't offer him coffee. "Your brother owes us a significant amount of money," Merrick said. "I know the number," Nora said. That got a reaction. Small, barely visible. Something shifted in the line of his jaw, a recalibration. "You know it. I ran the accounts 3 months ago. He doesn't know I know. It doesn't matter now." Merrick looked at her. Really looked, the kind of looking that had weight to it. "Your brother listed you as a co-signer on 2 of the agreements," he said. The coffee turned to something colder in her stomach. "He what? 2021. February and October. Your signature appears on both. That's not possible." She said it flatly, without theater, because she believed it. And then, a half-second later, she believed it a little less, because she thought about the documents her brother had put in front of her at Christmas 2 years ago. The ones he'd said were, "Just bank stuff. Boring, you know how it is. Just sign here and here so I can get the transfer done before the holidays." She had been visiting for 4 days. She had been tired. She had trusted him in the specific way you trusted someone you'd grown up alongside, someone who was family in the technical sense even when family didn't mean what it was supposed to mean. "He forged them," she said. "Or he tricked me into signing something I didn't understand." "That may be true," Merrick said. "It doesn't change the document." She looked at him. He looked back. There was something almost courteous about the way he delivered bad news. Not unkind, not theatrical, just precise. Like a doctor giving a diagnosis. "This is what is. This is what it means." "What happens now?" she said. "Now we discuss options. There aren't options. I'm an entry-level accountant in Atlanta. I make $43,000 a year before taxes. I have $2,200 in savings and $48,000 in student loan debt. I can't pay back $340,000. He didn't blink. "No," he said. "You can't. Then why are you here?" And this was the moment. She would think about it later, the shape of that pause, the way he set one hand on the arm of her $30 chair like he owned the chair and the apartment and the city outside, and said, very quietly, the thing that cracked the floor open under her feet. "Because I have a different kind of offer." She waited. "I need a wife," Merrick said. "Temporarily." 6 months. There are business reasons. You don't need to understand them. What you need to understand is that the arrangement would be legal, would be documented, and at the end of 6 months, your brother's debt would be cleared in full. The pigeon on the fire escape made a sound. Nora looked at this man in her dead-end apartment with his dark suit and his scar and his 2 silent associates in the hallway, and she said, "You're serious. I don't make jokes about contracts. I don't know anything about you. You'll be given a full briefing. You can ask questions. You can have a lawyer review the agreement. I'm not asking you to decide in the next 60 seconds. What would it involve? The arrangement." He considered the word with the same mild interest he'd given everything else. "You'd relocate. Live in my house. Attend events when required. You'd be introduced as my wife. What happens behind closed doors is your business. I have no interest in," he paused, complicating the arrangement. She should have said no. She knew she should have said no. The no was right there, sitting in her throat, fully formed, entirely reasonable. She had not asked for this. She had not signed up for this. She had spent her whole life being careful about exactly this kind of situation. The kind where someone more powerful than you made you an offer that sounded like a choice and wasn't. But $340,000. But her name on those documents. But her brother, who was useless and reckless and hers in the bone-deep way that family was yours even when they'd used you without asking. 6 months, she said. 6 months. And after? After you leave. You go wherever you want. We never have to see each other again. She looked at her hands. They were steady, which surprised her. She'd expected them to shake. She was the kind of person who shook when things got bad, who cried in parking lots after hard conversations, who kept it together until she was alone and then didn't. But sitting here, in front of this man, she felt something that was almost calm. Not peace, not relief. Just the flat, clear stillness of a person who has been backed into a corner and has run out of directions that aren't forward. "When would I need to give you an answer?" she said. "End of day," Merrick said. "I have a flight tonight." She nodded once. He stood. He buttoned his jacket in one smooth motion. He moved toward the door and then stopped, half-turned, and looked at her one more time with those measuring eyes. "You ran the accounts yourself," he said. "Yes, at $43,000 a year. Yes." Something in his expression shifted. Fractional, almost nothing. "All right," he said, and then he was gone, and the door was closed, and the apartment was exactly as it had been before, except that it wasn't. She called him at 4:47 p.m. She said yes. The house was not what she'd expected. She had expected something that announced itself, something in glass and steel that rose up from a private road like a monument to its own importance. She had expected gates. She had expected a certain kind of loudness that wealth sometimes produced, the architectural equivalent of a man talking too much about his own accomplishments. What she got was a house in the hills outside Asheville, 3 stories of pale stone set back into the landscape like it had grown there, old trees on either side, a long driveway, quiet. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the quiet of something that didn't need to prove anything. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon with 2 suitcases and the very specific feeling of a person walking into a building they'd never be able to fully map. Merrick met her at the door himself. She'd expected staff. There was staff, she would learn later. A woman named Mrs. Ellard who ran the household with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had seen everything and found all of it mildly interesting. But Merrick was at the door. He looked at her suitcases. He looked at her. "That's everything," he said. "I travel light." She thought she saw something pass across his face. Not pity, something more complicated than pity. "There's a budget for clothing," he said. "You'll need it for events. Mrs. Ellard has the card. I don't need someone else's money for clothes. You're going to be at a fundraiser in 2 weeks with people who spend more on a single jacket than you make in a month. It's not personal, it's operational." She hated that he was right. She hated the clean, unapologetic way he said it, like he was reading a line from a manual. She picked up her suitcases and followed him inside without saying anything else, because that was the other thing she'd learned to do. Save the argument for when it would count. Her room was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a hallway that smelled faintly of cedar and something she couldn't name. The room was large, with windows that looked out over the back garden, and a bed that was very obviously made by someone who thought mattresses should feel like being held. She sat on the edge of it fully dressed and stared at the ceiling for approximately 45 seconds before she told herself to stop. She was here. This was the deal. 6 months. She could survive 6 months of anything. The first week was strange in the way that all displacements are strange. The newness of the faucet handle, the light switch in the wrong place, the unfamiliar sound of a house settling. She developed a routine because routine was the only thing she knew how to hold on to when everything else was unfamiliar. She was up by 7, she ran figures in the mornings, habit, even without a job to run them for. She ate breakfast in the kitchen with Mrs. Ellard, who appeared to have adopted her in the specific way that competent women sometimes adopted stray ones, with no fuss and no commentary, just extra coffee and the occasional oblique piece of advice delivered to the ceiling rather than directly. Merrick was present in the house the way weather was present, felt rather than always seen. She'd hear him sometimes in the early morning, already on calls in his office, the low murmur of a voice that never seemed to raise in volume regardless of what it was saying. She'd pass him in the hallway and he'd nod. She'd come to dinner and he'd already be at the table, and they'd eat in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. Exactly, but wasn't comfortable either. It was the silence of 2 people in a negotiation, which was exactly what they were. She started to notice things about him the way you noticed structural details of a building you were living in. Not because you were looking, but because you couldn't help it. The scar through his eyebrow had company. She saw a second one, longer, at the base of his left wrist. When he pushed up his sleeve to check his watch, he read on paper, not screens. He kept a glass of water, never wine, on his side of the table. He paid attention to things, small things, the things people assumed powerful men didn't notice. He noticed when she'd rearranged the books on the study shelf. He noticed when she skipped breakfast. He said nothing about either, but he noticed. The fundraiser was in Charlotte. She wore a navy dress that Mrs. Ellard had selected, and that fit the way clothes in movies fit, like it had been built for her specifically, which it had, though she hadn't asked for that. Merrick looked at her when she came downstairs and didn't say anything, which she was starting to understand was his version of a compliment. The event was everything she'd expected. Money in all its most performative forms. People who wore the kind of smiles that took maintenance, conversation that meant 17 different things depending on who was in earshot. She'd grown up on the outside of rooms like this. Looking in, she knew which people mattered and which people thought they did and how to tell the difference. Merrick stayed near her, not hovering, more like adjacent. Present, his hand was at the small of her back twice, briefly, when she needed to navigate through a crowd, and the first time it surprised her, and the second time it didn't. She smiled at people whose names she was told and forgot. She answered questions about how they'd met with the story they'd agreed on, which was true in its bare bones. Met through business connections. Private. Didn't like to say too much. People accepted it. Money liked its privacy. It was near the end of the evening when a man named Rhodes, silver-haired, the kind of handsome that had clearly been more pronounced 30 years ago, pulled Merrick aside for a conversation that had the particular body language of something serious, and Nora stood at the bar with a glass of sparkling water and looked around the room and thought, I am not for the first time. I am not afraid of this. She'd expected to be afraid. She'd expected to feel like an imposter, a planted figure in a scene that belonged to other people. Instead, she felt, watching the room, watching the ways the alliances tilted and the calculations ran behind people's eyes, something closer to recognition. She understood this. Not the money, not the world, but the math of it, the way power distributed itself, the weights and counterweights, the invisible columns that balanced every room like this one. Merrick came back. He stood beside her and picked up a glass of water and looked out at the same room she was looking at. Rhodes, she said. He wants to renegotiate something he signed 3 years ago because the terms no longer favor him, Merrick said. Does he have leverage? He thinks he does. Does he? Merrick looked at her sideways. You want to run the numbers? I want to know if he has leverage, she said. It's a yes or no question. No, Merrick said. He doesn't. Then why are you concerned? I'm not concerned. I'm considering timing. If you push back before he tries to formalize the renegotiation request, he'll feel cornered and escalate publicly. If you wait until he's committed the ask to paper, you have documentation, and he's already overextended. Silence. She could feel him looking at her without looking back. You're right, he said. It came out like he was mildly surprised that this was a thing he was saying. She took a sip of her water. I know. Something changed after that. Subtle at first, the way things shifted in a room when the temperature dropped by 2 degrees, something you felt before you identified it. Merrick started leaving the study door open in the evenings. She started bringing her laptop in without asking, sitting in the corner chair while he worked at the desk, both of them occupied with their own things, the fire going in cold weather. No need to account for the silence. He started showing her documents sometimes, not requesting help, exactly. More like placing them where she could see them if she wanted. She looked. She said things when she had something worth saying. He listened, which was more than she could say for most people she'd worked for. One evening in the 3rd month, she asked him about the scar on his wrist. She hadn't planned to. It came out the way things came out late at night when the room was warm and you'd been sitting in comfortable quiet long enough that the careful voice in your head went a little soft. He looked at the scar for a moment. Then he said, "I was 17, made a decision that wasn't mine to make. Someone reminded me." She looked at him. "Are they still around to remember it?" "No," he said. "Simply, Fennetley." She nodded and went back to her laptop. Later she thought about the 17 things that single syllable had contained and decided she respected him for not unpacking any of them. The problem with the arrangement was that it worked. She hadn't accounted for that. She had accounted for awkwardness, for distance, for the formal pleasantness of two people honoring a contract. She had not accounted for Mrs. Ellard leaving them both coffee and disappearing tactfully. She had not accounted for the way Merrick looked at her across a conference table when someone said something she clearly disagreed with. That fractional thing, that almost smile, the acknowledgement that he'd seen her face and found it accurate. She had not accounted for the way he remembered things, that she took her coffee black, that she had a particular hatred of imprecise language, that she didn't sleep well on the days she talked to her brother. He never mentioned these things directly. He just arranged for them, coffee ready, conversations steered away from her brother when they had company, a book that appeared on the nightstand that she hadn't asked for and somehow wanted. She told herself it was operational. He was maintaining the performance of the marriage. That was what she was there for, after all. She had a contract and a role, and 6 months had a number attached to them, and the number was getting smaller. 2 weeks before the end of the term, he came to find her in the garden. She was sitting on the low stone wall near the back, the one that looked out over the hillside, and she was going through a contract for one of his subsidiaries that he'd asked her to review. Technically, she was still doing this. Technically, she had just kept doing it because the numbers were interesting, and she was good at it. And there was nothing wrong with being good at something, even if it fell outside the formal terms of the agreement. He sat down on the wall a few feet from her, not beside her, not far from her. That distance he kept, the one that felt deliberate rather than accidental. "I want to talk about the contract," he said. "I found 3 issues," she said. "The liability clause in Section 4 is unenforceable as written, and the payment schedule in Section. Our contract," he said. She stopped. She put the papers down on the wall beside her. She looked out at the hillside because looking at him directly felt like something she needed to work up to. "The 6 months," she said. "Yes, it ends in 2 weeks. I know when it ends. A bird somewhere, whined in the tree line, the very particular quality of afternoon light in the hills when October started to mean it. I'm not going to pretend it's been what either of us expected," Merrick said. "No, I'm also not going to." He stopped, started again. "I don't ask for things." "I know," she said. "This is..." Another stop, and then very quietly, with the same flat precision he used for everything else, the same refusal to perform or dramatize. "I'd like you to stay." She turned to look at him then. He was looking at the hillside. The line of his jaw was set in the way it set when he was thinking through something difficult. When he was weighing a position, the way you weighed a position before you committed it to paper. She'd seen that expression on him a dozen times now. She knew what it meant. She knew that it cost him something to say what he'd just said, that asking was not a language he'd learned voluntarily, that whatever had happened to the boy who got the scar at 17 had taught him a very specific lesson about what it meant to want things. "On what terms?" she said. Because she was still an accountant, even here, even now, even when her hands were not as steady as she wanted them to be. "Yours," he said. "Whatever terms you want. I'll draw up whatever you need to draw up." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about her apartment in Atlanta with the mold ceiling. She thought about the $43,000 and the $48,000 in loans and the entry-level desk and the Monday mornings that all felt the same. She thought about her brother, whose debt was cleared, who would probably do it again, who was hers despite everything. She thought about the $30 chair and the coffee on the bus and all the exits she'd identified and never taken. She thought about the way he'd said "you're right" at a party in Charlotte, like it cost him nothing, and somehow everything. "I'd need my own space," she said. "My own work. Real work, not decorative. You've been doing real work for 3 months. I'd need it formalized. Agreed. And I want to handle the road situation myself, she said. I have an approach. Something moved through his expression. Tell me, after you agree to the terms. He looked at her then, really looked, the same way he'd looked at her in her apartment doorway that first morning, taking the measure of something. Except now she knew what he found, because she'd been there while he found it, and she knew it was the same thing he'd found in every room they'd been in together. Someone who ran the numbers, who didn't flinch from what they said, who wasn't going to be managed or maneuvered or handled. Agreed, he said. She nodded once. She picked up her papers. The liability clause, she said, is the more urgent issue. Let me finish the subsidiary contract first. Of course, he said. He didn't move. She didn't either. The afternoon stayed where it was, warm and particular, neither of them looking at each other, and both of them exactly where they'd decided to be. The debt was cleared. The contract was rewritten, 37 pages this time, with better terms, her terms, which she had insisted on reading aloud to him while he sat across the desk with his hands folded and the look on his face of a man who had gotten more than he'd negotiated for and was not displeased about it. Her brother called in November to ask for money. She said no. It was the first no she'd said to him in 15 years, and it came out easier than she expected, which was maybe because she was finally in a room where no was a word that meant something, where the terms were visible and the numbers were honest, and nobody signed anything they didn't understand. Merrick came into the study while she was still on the phone. He looked at her face when she hung up. He didn't ask. She looked at him. Tell me about roads, she said. He sat down across from her. He opened the file, and she started to work.